Welcome to the virtual IACS 2021 conference. On behalf of my co-author Roxane Coche from the University of Florida, I am Travis Bell from the University of South Florida, and thank you for attending our presentation. Is staying on top of the world enough to be on the front page? Analysis of American newspapers' front pages the day after the USWNT's second consecutive World Cup victory. So in 2019, the USWNT won the World Cup in France with a 2-0 victory over the Netherlands. And it was a repeat victory that followed their 2015 win in Canada. That was a 5-2 win over Japan. So we had done a framing study about the 2015 World Cup and how US newspapers framed the victory then. That appeared in Communication and Sport in 2018. We followed that with a new framing study about the 2019 victory that was recently published in Journalism Practice. Now, this study applies an agenda-setting framework to 909 US newspaper front pages the day following each of those USWNT World Cup victories to examine how the coverage evolved between 2015 and 2019. Now, the first research question emphasized presence. The second research question explored prominence, both for placement on the front page and for the content provided, such as a headline, a nut graph, or the story. And the third research question examined the visual depiction for the USWNT on US front pages. So the first research question that looked at overall quantity of coverage and differences. Of the 909 total newspapers' front pages, 748, or 82%, featured coverage of the previous day's World Cup final. In 2015, that was 81%, which was 396 newspapers, of the analyzed front pages that featured the USWNT. And in 2019, that percentage increased to 84%, despite a decrease in the overall number of newspapers to 352. The difference between 2015 and 2019 was not significantly different. The data thus shows that most newspapers deemed the story worthy to reach the front page at a similar rate. Now, the second research question asked, did the prominence of USWNT coverage regarding front page placement differ from 2015 to 2019? So to calculate prominence, the placement of the story and the elements of coverage were measured. This slide emphasizes the placement of the story. So regarding placement, 30% of the 398 newspapers from 2015 made the USWNT's victory their centerpiece or lead story, which is significant in newspaper layout and design. The majority of those stories featured it close to the newspaper's name, either over the masthead or at masthead level, which is where the newspaper name is placed. The remaining 11% of newspapers provided less prominent coverage, often in what are known as front page rails. Those are vertical columns that list multiple or brief stories featured in one collective subsection or under the fold. And so the placement in 2019 coverage followed a similar distribution, where most of the stories, approximately 53%, appeared close to the newspaper's name, either over the masthead or at masthead level, and 1/3 of the 366 USWNT stories were featured as the centerpiece or lead story. The remaining 14% offered less prominent USWNT coverage, namely in the bottom banner, which runs, as you would imagine, across the bottom section of the newspaper, or elsewhere under the fold. So as a result, the USWNT appeared in less prominent spaces under the fold of the newspaper on only 6% of newspapers from 2015, compared to 11% in 2019. So what this means is that the coverage would not be visible on most newspaper stands, and this difference was statistically significant, which sort of downplays the significance of the victory in 2019. Regarding coverage elements, the great majority of the newspapers that featured the USWNT on their front page included a headline. USWNT stories from 2015 were as likely to include a headline as those from 2019. However, while slightly more than half of the 2015 newspapers with USWNT coverage included a subhead, only 37% of those in 2019 included a subhead. This difference is statistically significant and so shows a substantial decrease in transition from headline to subhead. But overall, regarding photographs, 364 pictures from 2015 were included in the overall coverage, as well as 327 from 2019 that included at least one picture. So RQ3 asked how the Women's World Cup coverage was visually represented on front pages in 2015 and 2019. As mentioned above, we gave you the breakdown of those numbers. The majority of those stories were illustrated by only one photo, but 8% had 2 photographs and less than 2% had 3 photos and less than 1% actually had 4 pictures. Bringing this back to the overall population, about 3/4 of US newspapers printed in 2015 and in 2019 featured at least one picture. And thus the difference between the 2 years was not significant. In total, 415 USWNT related photos were published on the 2015 front pages, and 373 such photos were published on 2019 front pages. Now, for both years, an average photo used 20.3 square inches of space on front page, which represents about 11% of a tabloid-sized paper. So in both years, a few newspapers, such as New York's Newsday, California's Record Searchlight, and the Boston Herald, skewed the data with extremely large USWNT-related photos that covered more than 80% of their respective front pages. Yet the median size for USWNT-related photos was also comparable between 2015 and 2019. Finally, regarding shape, about 15% of the pictures published in 2015 were clipped, which requires a higher level of design production and thus emphasizes the value of the USWNT story. For example, instead of being in a standard rectangular or circular shape, it's cut around a unique shape like the Women's World Cup trophy, or as you see here with Carly Lloyd, in a human form. In comparison, only 8% of the 2019 photos were clipped. Overall, photos were significantly more likely to be clipped in 2015 than in 2019, which is maybe not surprising given that they had not won a World Cup in several cycles. Both 2015 and 2019 front pages featured the exact same number of photo captions, 155 each, with comparable distributions, which again is just another sort of sub-element of the production design. So what do we learn from all of this? Well, first, the overall coverage on the US newspapers' front pages is a positive indication for media representation of women's sports. The fact that more than 3/4 of newspapers placed the victory on the front page of the paper, and it was not just relegated to the sports sections, recognizes a conscious decision by newspaper editors of the cultural significance of this win for its readers. Now, here's an example of the Times News from North Carolina. It's the kind of typical front page based on the findings, which was prominence and placement, a strong visual through a picture, but not necessarily the center or lead story. Regarding second level agenda setting, the salience of USWNT coverage through placement and prominence offer mixed results. On the one hand, the great majority of stories, 87%, were placed in spaces corresponding with layout prominence. On the other hand, less than a third of newspapers, 32%, with USWNT coverage made a USWNT's victory the lead or centerpiece story. Second, the significant inclusion of photographs or use of bold headlines in prominent locations reinforces evidence of strong second-level agenda setting, as newspapers showed the importance of the team by emphasizing the use of visuals. These salient attributes within the overall coverage help describe and promote the USWNT victories as value-added content for the reader. And third and finally, the victory on a global sporting stage reinforces sports exceptionalism that is rampant in U.S. culture. U.S. media provide a specific lens to celebrate U.S. victories in international competitions such as the World Cup and the Olympics. The nearly identical replication of salient coverage following the 2019 victory suggests that winning a world championship, even in a time of fewer journalistic publications and limited resources, is enough for women's sports to remain on U.S. front pages.